The hospital room was filled with chaos. 20 doctors couldn't figure out what was wrong with his son. His father shouted, yet no one could understand the young millionaire's son. Only 10 years old, he cried in silence, his pain ignored, his mute lips unable to explain what was killing him inside. Time was running out, and every second pulled him closer to the edge. Then, a new nurse walked in, calm and determined, with a way to reach him no one else had. What happened after changed everything. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and also let us know where you are watching from in the comments. Enjoy the story. It was on a cold Monday evening that it all happened. Melinda had just secured her new nursing career and was ready to give it all her best. Little did she know that the events of that day would forever change her life. She never saw it coming. The hospital corridors smelled faintly of antiseptic, a mix of sharp cleanliness and something sad that lingered in the air. Melinda, dressed in crisp white scrubs, clutched her clipboard with steady hands. Though inside, she carried the nervous thrill of someone stepping into a role she had long dreamed of. Her shoes squeaked softly against the polished floor as she followed the head nurse who was briskly leading her to the pediatric ward. "You'll be looking after the Jefferson boy," the senior nurse said, lowering her voice as if the name alone carried a kind of weight. "Be patient. He's complicated." Melinda nodded, unsure what to expect. She had dealt with children in pain before, children frightened of needles, children missing their parents. But the way her colleague said complicated made her wonder if she was being handed something far beyond the usual. When the door opened to his private room, the sight hit her immediately. A small boy of 10 lay curled against the stiff white sheets, tears streaming down his pale cheeks. His chest rose and fell in uneven, shallow breaths. His dark hair clung damply to his forehead, and his small fists were clenched so tightly it looked painful. Doctors hovered like shadows around him, their murmurs low but tense. One adjusted a chart, another pressed a stethoscope to the boy's chest, and yet another scribbled notes with a furrowed brow. All of them seemed preoccupied with numbers, tests, and theories. None of them seemed to truly see the child in front of them. Melinda lingered by the doorway, her heart twisting. His cries were not like the loud, demanding wails of most children in pain. His were softer but relentless, a stream of soundless grief, as if each tear carried a secret only he knew. Across the room, a tall man in a tailored suit paced back and forth, his gold watch glinting under the fluorescent lights. His shoes clicked sharply against the floor with every impatient turn. This was the boy's father, clearly a man accustomed to control, power, and quick solutions. But here, in this sterile hospital room, he was powerless. "What do you mean you don't know?" the father barked, his voice breaking through the tense silence. His tone was not cruel, but desperate, like someone drowning and thrashing for air. "You're telling me you can't even explain why my son won't stop crying?" The doctors exchanged uneasy looks. One cleared his throat. "We're doing everything we can, Mr. Jefferson. Physically, he checks out. The scans show nothing abnormal. We suspect it might be psychological." "Psychological?" The father's voice cracked. He turned toward his son, his face pale with anger and helplessness. "My boy is suffering, and you're telling me it's all in his head." The boy cried harder, his body trembling. He turned his face into the pillow as though trying to hide from all the voices and the confusion swirling around him. Melinda felt a pang in her chest. She wanted to move closer, to comfort him, but as the newest nurse in the ward, she hesitated. She didn't want to overstep, not with senior staff present and a father who seemed to demand control of every detail. But then, something in the boy's tear-streaked face pushed her forward. With quiet steps, she moved past the cluster of doctors and gently approached the bed. Her presence was different, soft, unhurried, unobtrusive. She bent down slowly so that her eyes were level with his. For a moment, his sobs faltered, curiosity flickering through the storm of his grief. "Hi," she whispered, her voice calm, almost melodic. "My name is Melinda. I'm here for you." The boy blinked, confused. He opened his mouth as though to say something, but no words came. Instead, his lips trembled, and a broken sound escaped his throat. His frustration mounted, and the tears returned in a rush. That was when it struck her. The way he struggled, the way his attempts to speak ended only in silence. She studied him carefully, her mind piecing together what others had overlooked. She realized with a jolt of clarity, He was mute. The doctors had misread his silence as defiance. His father had mistaken it for stubbornness. But Melinda saw it for what it was, a cry for help he could not express in words. She didn't pull away. She didn't turn her frustration on him. Instead, she gently reached out, placing a hand on the bed rail, close enough for him to see she was present but not forcing contact. Then, with deliberate calm, she lifted her hands and signed a simple question. "What's wrong?" The boy's wide eyes froze on her fingers. For a heartbeat, the room seemed to stop breathing. His sobs stilled, replaced by a stunned silence. No one had asked him like this before. No one had met him in his language. His lips parted in disbelief. Then he looked directly at her, his tears still falling but softer now. Slowly, haltingly, his own hands moved, unsure at first, then stronger as he realized she understood. His signs came shaky, broken, but clear enough. "It hurts." Inside, nobody listens. Nobody knows. Melinda's breath caught. She could feel the weight of his words pressing against her heart. This wasn't just about pain in his body. This was pain that lived deeper, pain born of isolation, of never being heard, of being misunderstood even by those closest to him. She nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving his. "I hear you," she signed back. "You're not alone." The boy's tears spilled again, but this time, they were different. They weren't the endless stream of despair she had walked in on. They carried relief, as if finally, someone had reached across the barrier that had trapped him for so long. Behind her, she sensed the doctors watching in stunned silence. His father had stopped pacing, his sharp breaths audible in the quiet. But Melinda stayed focused only on the boy. Her calm presence seemed to soften the room itself, pulling him into a space where he could finally breathe without fear. Minutes passed as she gently asked him small questions, giving him space to answer with hesitant signs. His responses were fragmented but powerful. He told her, in the broken rhythm of his hands, that he felt invisible, that his silence wasn't stubbornness but a prison. He told her that sometimes he thought no one would ever truly understand. Melinda listened, every fiber of her being tuned to his words. She didn't try to fix everything in that moment. She didn't press him with demands or overwhelm him with instructions. She simply gave him what he needed most, the chance to be heard. By the time she leaned back, the boy's breathing had steadied. His swollen eyes still shimmered with tears, but there was something new there too. Hope. For the first time in what seemed like forever, he felt the invisible door of his silence opening. His father stepped closer, his voice softer now, stripped of its commanding edge. "What did he say?" Melinda glanced at him, then back at the boy. She smiled faintly. "He said, nobody ever listened. Until now." The room fell into silence once more, but it was no longer the silence of despair. It was the silence of revelation, the moment when truth finally found its way through. And for Melinda, standing there in her crisp new scrubs on her very first day, she realized she had not just met a patient. She had stepped into a story that would mark her life forever. The room had grown quieter after Melinda reached the boy, but it was the fragile kind of silence, like a pause between storms. His father stood near the window, arms crossed, while the doctors shuffled uneasily, their confidence rattled by the way the young nurse had broken through to the child. The boy's small hands rested on the blanket, his breathing still uneven, his chest rising and falling as though each breath weighed too much for him. Melinda remained by his side, her eyes steady, her posture soft but firm, waiting for him to speak in the only way he could. At first, his hands trembled. His fingers moved clumsily, not with the fluent grace of someone confident in sign language, but with the shaky determination of a child struggling to make himself understood. Melinda leaned closer, patient, encouraging him with her eyes. "Hurt," he signed. Hurt inside. Her heart clenched. "Show me," she signed back. His hands lifted again, faltering, stopping, starting. Then, slowly, the truth spilled out, not in a flood, but in broken fragments that cut even deeper. He signed of a day at school, of the laughter of other children echoing in the playground. He signed of a boy larger than him, a bully who had made him a target because of his silence, because of the way he was different. And then, he signed of the moment when the bully shoved him hard, slammed him down onto the hard ground. The memory was vivid in his gestures, his small body hitting the earth, the sharp pain exploding through his side, and the confusion of everyone watching but no one helping. Tears clung to the edges of his swollen eyes as his hands moved again. Since then, pain won't stop. Getting worse. Melinda felt her chest tighten as though invisible fingers had closed around her lungs. It was no longer a mystery. The boy wasn't crying because of fear or stubbornness, as the others believed. He was crying because something was terribly wrong inside him, something his silence had hidden until now. She reached out, her hand hovering over his as if to steady him. "You did the right thing telling me," she signed softly, her fingers slow and deliberate. "You're safe now." The boy's eyes met hers, wide, desperate, pleading with a depth no 10-year-old should carry. Behind her, one of the doctors shifted impatiently. "Nurse," he said, his voice tight. "We've already ruled out physical injury. The scans." "No," Melinda interrupted, surprising even herself with the sharpness in her tone. She turned to face them, her voice low but unwavering. "You didn't listen. He was thrown to the ground. He's been in pain ever since. He's telling us it hasn't stopped. Look at him. Look at his pallor, his shallow breaths, the tension in his body. This isn't just fear. This is damage." The doctors exchanged uncertain looks, murmuring among themselves. One adjusted his glasses. It could be residual discomfort. "Residual discomfort doesn't make a child cry himself hoarse for hours," Melinda shot back. She turned to the boy again, her eyes searching his face. His skin was pale, almost waxy, and sweat dampened his hairline. Every breath rattled faintly, shallow and tight. Her training screamed at her. Something was bleeding inside him. "Order new tests," she demanded, her voice cutting like a blade through their hesitation. "Full imaging. Now, before it's too late." The father stepped forward, his face ashen but resolute. "Do it," he barked. "Whatever she says, do it." The authority in his voice left no room for argument. Within moments, staff were rushing to prepare equipment. The boy was lifted gently onto a gurney, his small fingers clutching at the blanket as if clinging to the last thread of safety. Melinda walked beside him, her hand never leaving the rail, her gaze fixed on him with fierce protectiveness. As the doctors hurried him toward testing, Melinda's mind reeled with the weight of what he had revealed. A child, bullied and broken, left unheard for days because no one thought to ask in his language. His suffering had been dismissed, his silence mistaken for stubbornness, when in truth he had been screaming all along, just not in a voice they could hear. The memory of his trembling hands haunted her as she walked beside the gurney. "It hurts." Inside. "Won't stop." Back in the corridor, the father trailed behind, his normally commanding presence dimmed by fear. For all his power, for all his wealth, he was utterly helpless now, dependent on the voice of a boy who could not speak and the intuition of a nurse who had only just stepped into their lives. Melinda glanced back at him briefly, then turned her eyes to the boy once more. She leaned close and signed, "I believe you. They'll see it now. You're not alone." The boy's lip trembled, and for the first time since she had met him, there was something in his eyes other than despair. A flicker of relief, a faint light of trust. Minutes later, as the testing began, the results started to paint a picture the earlier scans had missed. Shadows on the imaging, bleeding where no one had thought to look. The doctor's murmurs grew urgent, their faces pale as the reality unfolded. Melinda's instincts had been right. She stood at the edge of the room, her fists clenched, her pulse pounding as though it were her own life being examined. Every fragment of his confession replayed in her mind, not just as signs on his hands, but as truth carved into her very heart. He had carried this burden in silence, waiting for someone, anyone, to finally understand. And when no one else had, he had chosen her. For Melinda, the weight of that trust was heavier than anything she had ever borne. She knew in that moment that this was no ordinary patient. This boy's survival would mark the turning point not just of his life, but of hers as well. As the doctors moved quickly, preparing the next steps, she closed her eyes briefly, whispering a promise only he could feel. "You are not invisible anymore." The monitors beeped steadily, each sound slicing through the heavy air as though mocking the helplessness in the room. Melinda stood near the bed, her eyes locked on the pale boy whose frail body seemed almost swallowed by the sheets. The test results lay in the hands of the lead surgeon, his face grave as he read them. "Internal bleeding," he finally said, his voice low but urgent. "Severe." It's been progressing for hours, maybe longer. The words hung in the air like thunder after lightning. The boy's father staggered back, one hand gripping the edge of the wall for balance. His suit, so pristine and powerful minutes ago, now seemed like nothing more than fragile fabric draped over a man stripped of control. His lips parted, but no words came. For the first time in his life, wealth, influence, and power meant nothing. Melinda felt her pulse quicken. The truth was out, and it was worse than anyone had imagined. The boy hadn't been crying for comfort or attention. He had been crying because his life was slipping away. If she hadn't insisted, if she hadn't fought for him, his silent suffering might have been dismissed until it was too late. The surgeons moved quickly now, their hesitation replaced by urgency. Orders flew across the room. Prep for surgery. We need to move fast. Get the blood ready. Type O negative. Page anesthesia. We're out of time. The boy lay there, small and motionless, his breathing shallow, his eyelids fluttering as though he were drifting in and out of consciousness. Melinda bent down close to him, her heart breaking at the fragility in his face. His eyes opened just slightly, and she saw fear shimmering there, fear so raw it pierced her to the core. She leaned in and whispered, "I'm here. I won't let you go." Her words weren't grand, but they carried the weight of a vow. She wasn't his mother, nor his sister, nor any blood relation, but in that moment, she was everything he had, the anchor between life and death. The gurney wheels squealed as they unlocked the brakes. 2 orderlies and a doctor pushed it into motion, rushing the boy down the corridor toward the operating theater. Melinda walked alongside, one hand lightly on the rail, refusing to let him feel abandoned in those terrifying seconds. Each turn of the hallway echoed with hurried footsteps, with the distant shouts of nurses making way, with the heavy thud of fear pressing against the walls. Behind them, the father followed, his strides uneven. For once, his confident air was gone. He looked like any other father, desperate and powerless, watching strangers carry his entire world toward a set of double doors that threatened to close him out. When they reached the theater, the surgeons paused only long enough to gather the last instruments. The boy was already fading, his lips tinged with blue, his small fingers twitching weakly against the blanket. Melinda bent down once more. She caught his gaze, fragile but searching, and lifted her hand slowly, signing one final promise. "You're not alone." A tear slid from the corner of his eye. Then the doors swung open, swallowing him into the sterile light of the operating room. Silence followed. The kind of silence that felt louder than noise, pressing heavy on the chest. The corridor, moments ago filled with urgent commands, now stood frozen. His father stood outside, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. He pressed one hand against his forehead, his eyes closed, muttering words that Melinda could not hear, but that she recognized all the same. "Please." A man who had built empires, reduced to whispering prayers for the life of one small boy. Melinda's legs felt weak, but she held her ground. Her presence here was no longer just duty. It was personal. She had seen his pain, heard his truth when no one else would. And now, as the cold theater doors shut him away, she felt every second drag like an eternity. The father turned toward her, his face pale, his eyes wide with the unspoken question no man ever wanted to ask. Will he make it? Melinda swallowed hard. She could not lie, but she could not abandon hope either. "They're doing everything," she said softly. "He's strong, and he knows we're waiting for him." Her own words trembled in her chest, but she forced calm into her voice. It was what the man needed, and more importantly, it was what the boy would feel when he woke, if fate allowed it. The corridor stretched into stillness once again, broken only by the faint echo of footsteps retreating deeper into the hospital. Melinda leaned against the wall, replaying the boy's signs in her mind. Hurt inside. Won't stop. Those words weren't just a confession. They were a plea for someone to believe him. She closed her eyes, whispering silently to herself, "I believed you, and I won't stop fighting for you." For anyone watching, it was just another hospital emergency, another surgery in the countless that happened every day. But for Melinda, for the father, for the fragile boy beyond the doors, this was everything. Time was no longer measured in hours or minutes. It was measured in heartbeats, each one carrying him closer to life or further into darkness. And now, I want to turn this moment to you. Imagine standing in Melinda's place, looking into the eyes of a child on the edge of life, knowing his only hope depended on you noticing what no one else did. Would you have had the courage to fight against doubt? To demand answers when everyone else dismissed his pain? If you were there, with his life slipping through your hands, what would you have done? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The hours that followed were some of the longest of Melinda's life. The sterile hallway outside the operating room seemed endless, a place where time moved differently, slower, heavier. The soft hum of overhead lights and the occasional squeak of nurses' shoes across the polished floor only deepened the silence that stretched between every heartbeat. The boy's father sat hunched in one of the stiff waiting chairs, his usually composed face a mask of exhaustion and fear. His hands, those of a man who had signed million-dollar contracts without hesitation, now trembled as he rubbed them together. His eyes flicked to the double doors every few seconds, as though sheer willpower might force them to open. Melinda sat a few paces away, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap, though inside her chest was a storm. She replayed every sign the boy had shown her, every broken gesture that revealed his suffering. Her insistence had brought them here. She knew the truth before anyone else, but now the responsibility weighed heavily. If he didn't make it, would they blame her for giving them hope? Finally, after what felt like a lifetime, the doors swung open. A surgeon stepped out, his mask lowered, his face etched with the weariness of battle. Both the father and Melinda rose to their feet at once. "He made it," the surgeon said simply. "The bleeding was severe, but we were able to stop it. He's weak, but he's alive." The father let out a sound that was half a sob, half a laugh, a raw noise torn straight from the heart. He staggered forward, gripping the surgeon's arm as if needing confirmation. "Alive?" "Yes," the surgeon replied firmly. "Alive." Relief poured into the corridor like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Melinda's knees nearly gave way as the tension drained from her body. A wave of gratitude, fierce and overwhelming, rushed through her. He had survived. The boy had fought through the darkness and returned. Hours later, in the quiet of the recovery room, Melinda sat by his side. Machines beeped softly in steady rhythms, a chorus of reassurance after the chaos. The boy lay still, his small frame fragile beneath the sheets, but color had begun to return to his cheeks. His breathing, though shallow, was steady. Melinda reached out and gently wrapped her hand around his. It was small and cold at first, but slowly it warmed against her palm. She sat like that for what felt like forever, unwilling to move, unwilling to let him wake alone. Then, faintly, his eyelids fluttered. Slowly, with effort, they opened. His eyes, dull from exhaustion but alive with something unspoken, searched the room until they landed on her. A weak smile tugged at the corner of his lips. His fingers twitched slightly against hers. "You're awake," Melinda whispered, though she knew he couldn't hear her. She squeezed his hand gently, leaning closer so he could see her face, her presence steady and unshakable. His fingers lifted, shaky and clumsy from weakness, but determined. Slowly, painfully, he formed signs. "You stayed." Tears burned in Melinda's eyes, but she held them back, nodding firmly. She lifted her free hand and signed back, "Always." His hands moved again, slower this time. "You saved me." Her throat tightened. She shook her head softly, brushing her thumb across his hand. "You were brave. You held on. You saved yourself." But the boy shook his head, his expression fragile, yet resolute. "No, you heard me. Nobody hears me. Only you." Those signs, those trembling, halting signs, broke something deep within her. He wasn't just thanking her for saving his life on an operating table. He was thanking her for saving him from a different kind of death, the slow suffocation of loneliness, the torment of being invisible in a world that never stopped to listen. At the foot of the bed, the boy's father stood watching, his usually commanding presence subdued. He had always believed his money could shield his son, that wealth could buy the best doctors, the finest care, the perfect answers. But in this moment, he saw the truth. None of it mattered. It wasn't fortune that had saved his boy, but the compassion of a nurse who had chosen to listen. The man's eyes filled with something rare for him, humility. He pressed a hand over his mouth, his shoulders trembling. For once, he had no power here. The quiet strength of this young woman had done what he, with all his influence, could not. The boy signed again, slowly, each gesture heavy with meaning. Thank you for not leaving me alone. Melinda's hand tightened around his. She leaned close, her eyes shining. You will never be alone again, she signed back. The boy's eyelids drooped, exhaustion pulling him back toward rest, but peace lingered on his face. His hand remained in hers, and even as he drifted back to sleep, his fingers curled around her gently, as though holding onto the lifeline she had given him. The room was quiet, but it wasn't the silence of despair anymore. It was the silence of hope, the silence that comes after a storm when the air feels washed clean, when life feels fragile yet renewed. And now, I want to turn this moment to you. Imagine waking from the edge of death, opening your eyes to find the one person who truly heard you sitting by your side. What would you say to them? How would you thank the person who not only saved your body, but also your soul from loneliness? If you were in the boy's shoes, what would your first words, or signs, be? Share your answer in the comments below. The mansion was unusually quiet that evening. For years, it had been filled with the sounds of staff moving briskly through hallways, the hum of conversations at grand dinners, the clink of glasses in rooms gilded with wealth. But tonight, all that grandeur seemed hollow. The master of the house, a man whose name opened doors across cities and whose fortune could tilt markets, sat alone in his study with his thoughts. The fire crackled in the hearth, but even its warmth couldn't thaw the chill of what had nearly been lost. His son, his only child, had hovered on the edge of death, and for all his influence and resources, he had been powerless to stop it. Doctors with degrees from the most prestigious institutions, machines that cost more than some people's homes, and yet none of them had saved the boy. It had been her, the nurse, Melinda. The memory of her face in those moments haunted him, calm when he had been frantic, firm when the doctors had faltered, compassionate when he himself had nearly broken under fear. And above all, her persistence, the refusal to let his boy's cries be dismissed, had made the difference between life and death. He leaned back in his leather chair, staring at the firelight flickering against the bookshelves. Gratitude was too small a word for what he felt. Debt was closer. For how do you repay someone who gives you back your child? The door creaked softly, and Melinda stepped inside at his request. She looked out of place in this room of polished wood and gleaming antiques, her plain uniform a stark contrast to the richness around her. Yet in that moment, she carried more presence than all the luxury combined. Sir, she said softly, unsure of why she had been summoned. The father rose slowly, his expression grave. He gestured toward a chair opposite his desk. Please sit. She obeyed, folding her hands in her lap, her eyes steady but humble. For a long moment, he said nothing, as though searching for the right words. His gaze drifted to the window where the night pressed against the glass, then back to her. I built my life on a belief, he began, his voice low, that money could solve anything, that there was no problem so large, no obstacle so high, that it couldn't be handled with wealth, connections, or power. Melinda remained silent, listening. And yet, he continued, his voice faltering slightly, when my boy was slipping away before my very eyes, all my wealth meant nothing. Not the finest hospital, not the best equipment, not even the best minds. They didn't save him. You did. Her lips parted slightly, as though to protest, but he lifted a hand to stop her. Don't. I know what I saw. You listened when no one else would. You understood him. You refused to let them dismiss him. Without you, I would have buried my son this week. The words cracked something in his voice. He turned away briefly, gathering himself before facing her again. I owe you a debt I can never repay, but I want to try. He reached for a folder on his desk, slid it open, and pulled out a document. With it was a check, its figures written so boldly they seemed almost unreal. $20 million. Melinda gasped, her eyes widening as her hand flew to her mouth. Sir, I can't accept this. This isn't payment, he said firmly. I don't pay people for saving my son's life. This is gratitude. This is acknowledgement that your presence is priceless, that no amount of money could equal what you've done, but this is what I can give. She shook her head, overwhelmed. I was just doing my duty. Any nurse would have. No, he interrupted sharply. Not any nurse. They were all there, and none of them saw him. None of them heard him. You did. You gave him back to me. The room grew still. She lowered her eyes, the weight of his words pressing heavily against her heart. But he wasn't finished. He leaned forward, his voice softening. "There is something else. I don't want you to just take this and walk away. I want you to stay. Be by his side. Be his guardian, his protector. Someone he can trust, someone I can trust with what is most precious to me. Not just today, not just tomorrow, but for as long as he needs." Melinda froze, the enormity of his request sinking in. To be entrusted with the life of this boy, not as a nurse on shift, but as his personal guardian, that was no ordinary duty. It was a place within the family itself. She looked up, her voice quiet. "Why me?" The father's answer was simple, but it carried the force of absolute truth. "Because you listened." The fire popped in the hearth. The shadows flickered along the walls. For a long moment, neither spoke, the air thick with unspoken understanding. Finally, she nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "If that's what you wish, I'll stay. I'll protect him as if he were my own." Relief washed over his features, the kind that comes when a man who has carried the world on his shoulders finally finds someone willing to share the weight. He slid the check toward her. She hesitated, staring at it as though it were both a miracle and a burden. "Take it," he said. "Not because you want it, but because I need to give it. This is the only way I know to begin repaying a debt I can never clear." Her fingers closed slowly around it, her heart pounding. She knew this piece of paper would change her life forever, but it wasn't the money that moved her, it was the trust. That night, as she left the study, Melinda's mind whirled. The 20 million would alter her future, yes, but the real gift was something far greater, a place in a child's life where she could make a difference every day. And in his study, the father remained by the fire, his face softened by something rare in him, humility. For the first time in his empire-built life, he understood that wealth was not measured in numbers, but in lives saved, in hearts touched, and in gratitude too deep for words. The weeks that followed the surgery unfolded like the slow turning of a fragile page. The boy, once frail and lost behind his silence, began to heal, not just in body, but in spirit. Day by day, his strength returned, though it wasn't the doctors or the machines that guided him most. It was her, the nurse who never left his side. Melinda became more than a caregiver. She was his anchor. She was there each morning when he stirred awake, her quiet smile greeting him before the day could overwhelm him. She was there in the long afternoons when fear and memory tried to tug him back into shadows. And she was there at night, sitting by his bedside, her presence a reminder that the silence that had once imprisoned him was no longer empty. It was filled with understanding. The boy no longer wept in frustration when people failed to grasp his words. Instead, he turned to her, confident that she would help him bridge the gap between his world and theirs. Together, they practiced signs, his small fingers learning to shape words with more certainty, her patient eyes encouraging him each time he faltered. And slowly, something remarkable began to happen. The boy, once seen as the quiet, difficult child of a millionaire, started to stand taller. He no longer hid behind lowered eyes or clenched fists. He began to look outward, to meet the gaze of others, because he knew there was at least one person in the world who truly heard him. When he returned to school, it was Melinda who walked beside him through the gates. Whispers followed. The children who remembered him as the quiet boy now saw him stride with a new steadiness. His silence no longer seemed a weakness. With Melinda's presence, it became something different, something strong, something resilient. She was not just a nurse at his side, but a shield, a mentor, and a friend. For the boy, hope blossomed in the simplest of moments. Raising his hand in class, no longer afraid of the stairs, playing in the yard without the weight of fear, even smiling at a teacher who now took the time to learn his signs, inspired by Melinda's dedication. As for Melinda, her own life shifted in ways she could never have imagined. $20 million, an amount she could not even fathom before, now secured her future. The burden of bills, the weight of uncertainty, the quiet fears of how she would make ends meet. All of it dissolved overnight. Yet, when she looked at the check folded neatly in her drawer, it wasn't the number that made her heart stir. It was the boy. No sum of money could compare to the bond they shared. Every laugh he managed, every word he signed with growing clarity, every look of trust in his eyes. These were the treasures she valued most. The money gave her freedom, yes, but the boy gave her purpose. The story of what had happened did not explode into the world like scandal. It wasn't shouted across headlines or plastered in tabloids. Instead, it spread quietly, whispered in circles where influence lived, retold in softened tones as a lesson rather than gossip. People said the heir of one of the city's greatest fortunes had been saved not by the brilliance of doctors or the power of money, but by the compassion of a single nurse who chose to listen when no one else would. In drawing rooms and boardrooms, the tale lingered, unsettling in its simplicity. What was wealth when measured against empathy? What was power when measured against kindness? The story carried a weight that money could not buy. It carried truth. Within the mansion, life shifted as well. The father, once hardened by years of building empires, looked at his son differently now. He no longer saw weakness in his silence, but resilience. He no longer viewed Melinda as just an employee, but as family. And when he watched them together, her patient guidance, his son's growing confidence, he understood that no fortune could ever equal the gift she had given. Melinda herself remained humble. She bought nothing extravagant, made no grand displays of wealth. Instead, she used her freedom to learn, to grow, to become more than just a nurse. She studied ways to support children like the boy, children whose voices went unheard. She began quietly funding programs at schools, ensuring teachers had the tools to communicate with mute or deaf students. But through it all, she remained by the boy's side. Not out of obligation, not even out of gratitude, but out of love, the kind of love born from truly seeing someone and choosing to stay. One evening, months later, the boy sat with her in the garden of the mansion. The setting sun painted the sky in hues of gold and crimson, and the air was filled with the gentle rustle of leaves. He signed slowly, his movements more confident now. "I'm not afraid anymore." Melinda smiled, her chest swelling with pride. She signed back, "You are stronger than you know." He shook his head, his eyes steady on hers. "Because you believed in me." She reached out, brushing his hair back from his forehead. "Because you never gave up," she whispered aloud, though she signed the words as well. In that quiet moment, she realized how deeply both their lives had changed. He had found hope where despair once lived. She had found purpose where routine once guided her. And together, they had proven that compassion, not wealth, was the true power that could transform lives. Their story was not one of fame or fortune, but of something far greater, a reminder that in a world blinded by status, the smallest act of listening could become the greatest gift of all. And so, the millionaire's son, once misunderstood and unseen, walked forward into a future bright with possibility. And the nurse, once just another face in white, now carried with her the unshakable truth that she had changed not only his life, but her own. Both lives were bound together, not by money, but by compassion. And in that bond, they were changed forever. If you enjoyed this story of Melinda, the compassionate nurse, and young Master Jefferson, the millionaire's son whose life was saved, please like, share, and subscribe for more touching stories. We'd love to hear your thoughts on how their journey ended. Did it move you? Rate the story on a scale of 1 to 10 and tell us what stood out most. Also, drop the location of where you're watching from. It helps us connect this story with you.